It's that time again. This is a fairly important review, I think. So bear with me because I might run a little bit long, but I think it's all for they're all for the right reasons. This is a relatively short book, but possibly long review. I don't know. I'll see if I can keep it concise and pretty straightforward. This is Subverting Syria: How CIA Contra Gangs and NGOs Manufacture, Mislabel, and Market Mass Murder. Lots of alliteration there. By Tony Cartalucci and Nile Bowie. I hope I'm getting that right. So, first of all, this is a book, I actually got this in 2019. I forget how I stumbled onto this. This is one of those books that I ordered online after either a discussion thread online. Somebody might have mentioned it. I can't remember, but it was because of a lot of the stuff happening in Syria. And this was published and this is why this is really interesting. This was published in September of 2012. So this is almost 10 years old. Really fascinating. This is one of the few books that I've reviewed here lately that I would say, without question, if you found some of the other material on my site interesting, and if you've been following some of the world events, especially in the European continent, shall we say, Eastern Europe, I would highly recommend. Don't pass go, don't collect $200 till you get this book. This is well worth it. It's cheap. I say cheap. I think I checked earlier on Amazon. I think it's going for about $10 and change. So get this while you can, and I'll tell you why here in a second. But first off, what's it about? This is a great kind of a warning call of what was about to happen in Syria. And when you read this, if you followed what happened in Syria, a lot of these guys hit the nail on the head so well in explaining exactly what was going on in Syria. And interesting to note that this is basically a collection of articles that I believe they edited. One of the gentlemen here credited on the front, I think it's the Nile Bowie is the one who edited this all together. This was a series of articles then edited together as a book. And reading this is akin to eating a really good flan, that it's really rich and really dense. And it's one of those books you have to stop and think about some of it and think about the implications of some of this. Really good reading, but if you try to plow through it, some of this is a little overwhelming at times, but in a good way. Lots of really good information. So basically what they're saying is they give out kind of the roadmap as explained here in this chart from the Headquarters Department of the Army report, TC 1810 from November 10th. Anyway, they have a copy of this guerrilla warfare graph of how a strategy for regime change by way of guerrilla warfare. And what they're explaining in here is the strategy and kind of the template that's used currently to overthrow a lot of these governments like Syria and Libya and things like that. That this idea of going in and hiring local thugs to work using protest groups that you're funding, that these NGOs come in and fund these groups and then turn these groups loose as peaceful protesters. And typically a lot of these movements start out using genuine political movements within a target country, but then they put in people within those groups that help kind of steer them towards a specific political end. And one of the fascinating things in here is talking about, like in Syria, and I think he talks about Thailand. There's several countries where they talk about this being used, where they would hire these gangs to go into these protest groups and then use violent force against both sides to try to initiate a violent confrontation between the political protesters and the government. And no matter how this played out, the government always looked bad. So the whole point was, if you go and you infiltrate these or set up these political movements or infiltrate existing political movements, and it's a movement you're ostensibly sympathetic to, but you use that movement as cover for bringing in your actors that are there to steer that your way, but then you're going to have some sacrificial lambs by having or create some martyrs is probably a better way to put it, by having, in one case he talks about these guys being dropped off by motorcycle riders throughout the city that then set up posts as snipers, shooting into crowds and shooting both the government police and the protesters. And again, just to create chaos. So you're taking an already volatile situation and throwing a match into it. So you set off this powder keg of political tension and turn it into a violent confrontation by stirring everybody up. So the government police, they feel under threat because they have legitimately been shot at. Then the protesters, they've been shot at too, so they think, oh, I guess the gloves are off, so now we can attack the government guys. So again, in that situation, there's no way for the government to win, especially when you have Western press is writing the narrative. And I'll say more about that here in a second because I think that's a critical point. But I'll read the paragraph on the back because this is, I think, a really good summary of what is explained here. It says, one generally thinks of the American empire fighting against insurgents, as in Vietnam or Iraq. Leftists instinctively support rebels and revolutionaries. And it's important, this is my commentary, it's important that he's not saying leftist in a good or bad way, just in a sense, because I think these guys are somewhat leaning to the left in their politics on here. I think that's an important point. He's not saying that attacking people on the left. But anyway, leftists instinctively support rebels and revolutionaries, yet, as predicted by Webster Tarpley in his prophetic Obama, the Postmodern Coup, the U.S. regime change of 2008 heralded a shift to soft warfare. The U.S. would now foster rebellions to destabilize independent nations on the cheap. Indeed, historical research indicates that most revolutions and coups have represented such campaigns against rival nations. So they do a great job of laying out that template of how that works, of going into these target countries, and in this case, they're talking about Syria and Assad, and how that strategy is implemented. And they do a very good job of very clearly explaining it. It's very well sourced. They cite all the articles and everything that they're sourcing here. Where I find this very timely is in what's happening right now in Ukraine. That this is, there's several passages in this book, you could just cross out Syria and put Ukraine and you would get exactly what's happening right now. But a little bit more complicated because now we have a situation where this strategy that they're describing here is being used against the superpower of Russia, a nuclear-armed superpower of Russia. So it's a very bold and very arrogant move to try a lot of these tactics on a superpower with a very modern intelligence apparatus and modern warfare capabilities. So it remains to be seen how that will all play out. But I think it's really important, if you want to understand better what is happening in Eastern Europe and more importantly in Ukraine, this book will do a great job. In fact, he even mentions some of kind of predicting what about the when they were putting in anti-ballistic missile systems into like Poland and Eastern Europe, and how Russia was having some problems with that. And John McCain even kind of, he quotes John McCain in here of saying, it says, McCain taunted heads of state in both Russia and China at the height of unrest in North Africa by claiming, quote, I would be a little less cocky in the Kremlin with my KGB cronies today if I were Vladimir Putin. I would be a little less secure in the seaside resort of President Hu and a few men who govern and decide the fate of 1.3 billion people, speaking about China. So it really, I think this is an important book in understanding the lead up. I think a lot of these little regime change adventures have been leading up to what we're seeing right now, which is the ultimate regime change adventure in trying these tactics against a modern, again, well-equipped, well-armed, with a full intelligence capability, superpower. So how that works out remains to be seen. But this, I think, is a great book that will help understand that. If you are curious about those things, again, reading this and now knowing what has transpired in Syria, I think a lot of you will appreciate that. Again, how prophetic a lot of this was. Now, what I was saying about the media and the narrative angle of this I think is a real important thing to understand. Is I think a lot of people that stumble into this line of research and a lot of the books that are out there, the one thing hanging over their heads that they can't get past is, well, how is this all coordinated? Like, how does that work? Because they can't imagine there being that kind of coordination. And I think an important thing to go back to, and I want to cover this again maybe later on in another video, really flesh this out some more. And when you get some time, search the Telecommunications Act of 1996. That is really a pivotal moment in modern communications that set the standard, or set the stage rather, for where we're at right now. And what that did was it consolidated, it allowed a massive consolidation of television and radio stations that was never possible before, that just was illegal before. And that Telecommunications Act threw out a lot of those laws as being outdated, and that totally retooled the media landscape. And many of you, if you're my age or so, you probably remember around that time, you started hearing a lot of radio stations. They would say a clear channel communication station. And that was when Clear Channel came through and bought out a massive amount of billboards, radio stations, TV stations, and the like. But we went from a lot of independent, smaller channels to having everything really condensed into the control of just a very few people. So it became much easier, and from 97 on, to coordinate a single message across all channels of communication. And you think about the power that comes with that, of being able to coordinate a single message across even what most people would think of as conflicting information sources. So you could have CNN and Fox News that seem to disagree, but really giving you the same basic message. And a good example of that is like what's happened, say Syria, for example. You could have CNN saying, hey, we're supporting these rebels and blah, 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 blah. And then you have Fox News saying, yeah, we're supporting the rebels, but it's not enough. We should go in there and have boots on the ground, blah, 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 and all that. So where the debate comes down to not whether or not we should even be doing it, you shift the debate into a false choice of how should we be doing it. So the understood becomes we should be doing it. Now we're not going to even debate that. It's now becomes an issue of how do we do the thing. So I think that's a really big, important piece of the puzzle of understanding that consolidation of media that occurred in 1996. And when you start looking at that and how that really consolidated a lot of power and really allowed that message to be condensed into where you could have just a very few people put a single message out across all news channels and have it accepted as gospel. And a funny thing happened with that was when in the early days of that, like in the late 90s, one of the ways people started realizing that this mass consolidation had occurred was in smaller media markets. There would be mild, like not major disasters, but minor weather events and things like that, that they would all of a sudden wonder, why isn't the radio talking about this? Or, some big thing would happen locally in a small area and the radio wouldn't be talking about it. Well, that's because it wasn't local. It was a dude, 1,000 miles away, and having his voice syndicated across, all these other channels, but it was designed to sound like he was a local guy. So that's when a lot of people started going, oh, wait a second, so this is not a local radio station at all. We're hearing something repeated. And another example of that on the music end, it was Jack. Here locally, there was a Jack 100.3 FM, which was had this real kind of cocky angle that, we're going to play whatever we want and just stick it to the people. And everybody's like, yeah. But they didn't even have a DJ. It was not even a real DJ. It was just this some voice actor that came in and recorded audio, and then they would just play random songs. So it was like they did away with any semblance of actual DJs or real radio personalities. So back to Subverting Syria. I'm curious, any of you who've read this, like I said, this is a quick read. It's only 114 pages or so. I'm curious, any of you who've read that, if you have opinions on this one way or the other. But I think this is really helpful in just understanding the mechanics of how these kind of wars work, because it's easy to get into some of the broader thinking about some of this stuff and not think about, this is really good for understanding how these things actually take place. And when you look at this template, you can't help but see a lot of parallels in a lot of other things happening here in the United States and abroad, where you go, wow, I see that formula there, and there. So anyway, any of you who've read this, I'd be really curious what your thoughts are on it. And I'd like to do a follow-up on this, because I have so much to say on this that I think I probably overstayed my welcome. But for now, definitely, if you're into this, if you're curious about a lot of what's happening overseas right now, especially if you followed some of the stuff with the Azov Battalion and all that, this will explain it. A lot of this will suddenly come into focus when you read this. So, very good book, Subverting Syria, from 2012, by Tony Cartalucci and Nile Bowie. Well, anyway, very good book. Get it if you're a curious person.